Dr. Parks, thank you. CCU colleagues, students, guests, friends, good morning. Great to be with you today. I can't look at this empty front row where only the speaker and the introducer dared to sit without remembering the old story of the pastor who was tired of the front row in his church being empty. Why does the sanctuary fill from the back every morning? He asked the Board of Elders at one meeting. He said that it had come to his attention that with a little investment, it could be arranged that only the back pew was ever in place. After it filled, it would slide to the front on rails, and another back pew would pop up behind it. I even have a donor to underwrite it, said the pastor. Problem solved. The chairman of the Board of Elders cleared his throat and said, "Pastor, that would be fine. Understand that you have a button that would move the pew to the front when it is filled. Is that right?" The pastor said, "Yes." And the chairman said, "Well, that would be fine on the condition that in each seat could be a button that would just drop you through the floor when we're tired of the sermon." I don't think they went ahead and made that bargain. I guarantee you that our guest speaker for this morning's Strategic Objectives workshop is not someone that you will be tempted to push that go away button, I'm finished listening button in any degree. Thomas Krannawitter is a professor of political science at Hillsdale College in Michigan. I got to know him when we were colleagues over the past several years at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy based in Southern California. Tom went on from there to Hillsdale. He went on to complete one of the most important books of the Lincoln Bicentenary that was just observed with such distinction here at Colorado Christian University, the book Vindicating Lincoln, Defending the Politics of Our Greatest President. Well worth picking up at Borders or Barnes or on Amazon. There are those few books which you really enjoy and find so beneficial you do not want them to end. That's how I felt about Vindicating Lincoln, Defending the Politics of Our Greatest President. Just a little bit of context personally from John Andrews about the strategic objectives of Colorado Christian University and this workshop series. I noticed in a diary that it's just about a year ago that Chuck King honored me by asking me to be one of the presenters at an earlier stage in this series. And this was really my first opportunity to stop and think about the strategic objectives that the president and the board had established for CCU 2 or 3 years ago. I had seen President Armstrong's little card with the objectives on them. Someone had pointed out to me that it's notable it's laminated. This is not done in pencil. There's nothing tentative about this. But Chuck, when I had the pleasure and privilege of presenting on original intent of the Constitution, it was really my first occasion to stop and think about not just what the objectives say, but how extraordinary it is that we have these objectives. In my work in the Colorado Senate, and since then, with a radio program and TV and newspaper commentary going on week to week, one of my themes has been backbone. I take my inspiration from the mountain skyline that we waken to each morning, looking to the west here. Colorado can claim to be the roof of North America or the backbone of the continent with the Rockies, but more deeply, the quality of backbone in individuals, in the body of Christ itself, in any nation or any organization is the difference between survival and extinction, ultimately. Do we know what we stand for? To me, it's so extraordinary that this university has this 13 baker's dozen of strategic objectives laid out so clearly. It's a cliche in organizations today that there's a vision statement and a mission statement and a list of core values, but they're usually pretty bland. And very often, having been promulgated, they sit in a binder on a shelf somewhere and nothing is done to make them real in the life of the organization. Couldn't be more different at this university. And one of the ways that they are made real is with our workshop series, such as we're gathered for this morning. Very much on point with what we'll be hearing from Dr. Krannawitter are CCU's commitment to help students learn to think for themselves. It's been said that part of what's wrong with America today is a liberal secularist orthodoxy where people flatter themselves that they are individuals, but the best description is a herd of independent minds. Such is not what we are as faculty and staff and administration at CCU. Such is not what we send forth into the world with our students and our graduates. The herd of independent minds has one notion about how America came into being and about the worthiness of America to hold its head high with pride as an example to the nations in the world of the 21st century. We're going to hear a contrary argument that breaks the spent ideas of the herd of independent minds. Spent ideas, that's another of the key points on our strategic objectives, that the university will debunk spent ideas and those who traffic in them. That we will be seekers of truth. Is there such a thing as truth? How stirring to have had Doug Groothuis from Denver Seminary challenge us several weeks ago with his insistence that whether one begins from Scripture or from classical philosophy, it's unavoidable that we must acknowledge truth, and it is disastrous if we fail to do so. But again, the herd of independent minds that flatter themselves that they are above such old-fashioned notions as truth in America and, unfortunately, Western civilization today believe, we've outgrown truth. You will hear from our speaker exactly the opposite argument, and with clinching conviction, I can guarantee you. Some of us who heard him give a shorter version of this presentation in this room yesterday afternoon to a full audience of students had that pleasant experience of going away, as you and I will this morning, with a fresh and evidence-based understanding of a key question: what makes America great? Now, to talk with us about what makes America great, please welcome Dr. Thomas Krannawitter.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen of Colorado Christian University. It's a real honor to be here. I've learned a lot about the university in the last 24 hours. It's an exciting time for all of you here, a time of growth, a time of renewed dedication. I've been asked to address this question, what makes America great? And there's a short answer, and there's a long, complicated answer. The short answer is that what makes America great are the principles of the American founding. I'm going to try to argue in the course of, what do we have? Do we have till noon, more or less, right, about? I'm going to try to argue that the principles of the American founding, or the American regime in speech, provides the best regime possible in a post-classical world. And I want to put a political edge on it. I tend to be a political sort of fellow. I teach politics. That's my world. And here's the political edge. I think the greatest political crisis that America faces today, the greatest political crisis, is not the current economic meltdown, as painful as it is. It is not the war in Iraq. It's not the war in Afghanistan. It's not immigration. It's not education. It's not same-sex marriage. It's not abortion. It's no particular policy issue. Rather, the most serious political crisis we face today is that the United States Constitution has become largely irrelevant to American politics, law, and government. Now, you might think I'm trying to sound like an alarmist. This is what I study. This is my world. And the fact is, for at least 50 years, all three branches of our national government have routinely ignored the Constitution or twisted its meaning so that it is unrecognizable. And the response of the American people is a big collective yawn. What's on 24 next week? That's what they're interested in. No one cares. I'll give you one example. If we can talk more about the current state of politics in the Q&A if you want to. We just had an important, really a historic in many ways, presidential election. And the Republican nominee in that election, John McCain, is the sponsor of the most sweeping restriction of free speech rights in American political history, the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Law, which punishes you, offers criminal punishment, if someone spends too much money or speaks his mind too loudly about politics prior to an election. When Senator McCain was sponsoring that bill in the United States Senate, he was pressed once by a reporter who asked him, he said, "Senator McCain, this bill of yours, it restricts how people can spend their own money. It restricts how people can speak about politics and their political opinions. Isn't this unconstitutional?" And you know what his response was? "I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea." He said if someone thinks it's unconstitutional, they're free to sue, and it will go to a court, and some judge can figure that out, whether it's unconstitutional or not. This isn't my business as a sitting United States senator. And we could reel off a lot of other examples, but routinely the Constitution is missing in action from our politics and our law. And why is this? I believe, for the sake of simplification, the Constitution has suffered two very serious criticisms. The first, which is the more theoretically sophisticated criticism, is more than 100 years old. It was the criticism first launched by a group of intellectuals who called themselves progressives. And these progressives, about 100 years ago, most of whom were academics or intellectuals who were studying, they either went to Germany to study with the Germans, or they studied with German-trained academics in American universities. They were reading Hegel, they were reading Marx, they were reading Darwin, and their argument was that the United States Constitution is old, it's outdated, that society is an evolving organism, and therefore government too should be an evolving organism. The most prominent progressive of all of them, Woodrow Wilson. Most of us know Wilson only as President of the United States, but he was actually a very accomplished academic. The first president to hold a PhD, was a professor at and later president of Princeton University. In his first book, he called your Constitution political witchcraft. He said the Constitution is a fundamentally evil document because it keeps American government mired in the 18th century. It doesn't allow it to grow and evolve, and therefore our most important political project in the modern world is to circumvent the Constitution, to get around or get beyond the Constitution. The second argument or criticism of the Constitution is the civil rights critique. The civil rights argument argues that the Constitution is a fundamentally racist and therefore a fundamentally immoral document. And therefore we modern Americans have no moral obligation to follow a constitution that is racist and immoral. And these two accusations, of course, reinforce each other. It has convinced many intelligent Americans to ignore the Constitution, because why should we pay any attention to a Constitution that is immoral and happens to be old and outdated? Those of us who are in the business of trying to recover the authority of the Constitution must answer these criticisms. We can't ignore them. We must confront them. And it requires two things. We have to be able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of any critical audience that the Constitution rests upon principles that are timeless, that there are principles that cut through time and cut across space, and the Constitution embodies those principles. Therefore, it is not outdated. And secondly, that the Constitution provides for a fundamentally decent and moral regime, that it is not an immoral constitution that was the work of racists. The only access we have to those principles are to go back and examine the principles of the American founding. The most eloquent and articulate statement of those principles is found in our own Declaration of Independence. But there's a lot of work that we have to go back and understand those. It's not merely a matter of reading the old documents. That is insufficient for this reason. We tend to think in a very different way. We speak in a very different vernacular today than the Americans did of 1776 or 1787. The modern educated mind really has become persuaded that relativism or nihilism is true, that there is no questioning the philosophic premise of nihilism, that no principles are timeless, that no principles cut across space. And yet, if we believe that, we'll never understand the argument of the founders. I like to ask my students, if my students think it's a good idea to be open-minded, this is not a trick question, just in a general, loose way, is it good to be open to new ideas, new arguments, new books? And most of them will reluctantly start nodding, yeah, sure, okay, that's why we're in college. We're here because we're open-minded. And I say, great, I agree. It's good to be open-minded. Here's our challenge today. Can we be open-minded enough to consider the possibility that just maybe there is truth with a capital T in the world? Are we open to that possibility? And if there is truth in the world, that means every opposing view is wrong. It might require that we make some judgments, as nasty as that word has become in the modern world. I was teaching a course in Claremont in Southern California a number of years ago, and I had a young lady who was quite open, quite proud of being a feminist, nihilist, atheist, and she got angry at me. She said, no, she banged the desk. I will not consider that there's truth, because that would mean I'm a bigot. If I think there's truth, then that means I'm closed off to all the other views, and I will not entertain that. And I turned to her and I said, well, my friend, you will never in 1,000 years understand the principles of your country, because the founders of your country believed in certain self-evident truths. And what you're saying is you are not open even to the possibility of understanding what those truths are. In other words, you're not really an intellectual. You're not here to think. You're here to cheerlead some cause. And she promptly left my class and gave me a drop slip the next week. Well, with those ideas in mind, what I would like to do, I've prepared a handout with some excerpts from some important documents from the American founding. Did everyone get a copy of this handout? If you'd pull it out for a moment, I'd like to walk through some of these arguments with you. If you open to page 3, what I've provided there are the first 2 paragraphs of the American Declaration of Independence. Now, most of you have probably seen this document, studied this document, maybe some of you teach it. I would like to unpack some of the philosophic arguments and assumptions that are here in the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the first thing that is remarkable about the American Declaration of Independence is the fact that it exists. It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? Think of when this document was written. It was approved on July 4th, 1776. How did things look from the American military point of view? If you were a betting man or a betting woman and you were in Vegas laying odds, the American Army versus the British Army, where would you put all of your money? You'd put it all on the British, right? What the Americans are attempting, in many respects, seems almost suicidal. George Washington and this ragtag band of teenage boys is going up against the most powerful army and navy on the face of the planet. And I like to describe the scene for my students, what exactly that was like to face the British Army. You know, that thing that the Americans called the Continental Army. It was not much of an army in the first year. It was a bunch of young boys who'd be full of bravado and think to themselves, we're going to go out there and we're going to get those British. And then they'd march out and they'd see the British, and they would see line after line after line of perfectly formed redcoats. And every one of those redcoats, they were professional soldiers. They carried a musket. They knew how to fire them with accuracy. Attached to the end of those muskets, one of the most fearsome things, this 3-foot razor-sharp blade of steel, a bayonet. You know what the British Army was really good at? You know what their expertise was? They would march up to a people and they would slice their bellies open. They were really good at that. It's what made them so feared around the world. When the Americans saw this, they did what any rational human being would do. They turned tail and they ran. That was Washington's biggest problem the first year, was trying to get his soldiers to fight. Who would want to fight against that? Everybody wanted to run. So things do not look well during the first year of the Revolutionary War. And yet here these Americans produce this statement justifying their cause. The whole argument here of the Declaration is a moral argument. Their argument is, we might not have the power to win. Might may not be on our side, but we think right is on our side. We deserve to win whether we are actually victorious on the battlefield or not. Let's read some of the opening lines here of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So we're at a specific moment in time in the course of human events. There are certain circumstances which compel the Americans to cut or dissolve the connections they have to another political power, in their case, the British Empire. We are no longer going to be subjects of the British Empire. We insist on sovereign independence. We want to become our own nation. We want an equal station among the nations of the earth, an equal position, an equal chair at the table of nations on the planet. Notice the standard that the Americans appeal to. They think they deserve this. They use that language, that they deserve it. Why are they entitled to an equal station? Do they say because we have certain 18th century values and we feel really, really, really strongly about them? Is that the standard that they appeal to? And if you share our 18th century prejudices and values, you too will agree that we are entitled to an equal station. What is the standard that they point out there in the very first paragraph? The laws of nature and of nature's God. There is a moral and political argument that's going to flow from this premise in the Declaration of Independence, and it all rests on the standard of the laws of nature and of nature's God. The idea, the assumption is, if you understand what the laws of nature are, you can understand the argument the Americans are presenting here in their Declaration of Independence. Wonderful. The grand question, of course, is, what is that? What are these laws of nature, and who is this nature's God? Well, let's unpack this a little bit. The laws of nature. In fact, let's unpack it a little more. Nature. Have you ever asked this question? Ask this question to your students. What is nature? This is the ground that provides the premise of the justification of the entire American cause in self-government. Nature they appeal to. What is nature? Someone give us a definition of nature. Jump in. I'm an informal sort of guy. What is nature?
All of God's creation.
All of God's creation, right? Ask any scientist. Do we have any biologists or chemists or physicists in the room? Isn't this anybody? Come on, we have some. There's a scientist back there. What do you study? You study nature, right? Isn't that what every scientist studies? He studies nature. If we don't have a window. If we had a window looking outside, I would point outside. So here's my imaginary window, okay? Look out the window, and what do you see? You see nature. Birds and trees and the sky and the stars and planets. That's nature. In other words, in the very first instance, nature is a recognition that there is a whole, W-H-O-L-E. There's a whole universe of which we are a part. We're in nature. We share nature. We have a nature, human nature. We're part of nature, but nature is bigger than us. Nature existed before we exist, and nature will continue to exist long after we're gone. So it's pointing to something larger than us. How about this thing called nature? Is nature a chaos or a cosmos? These are the two terms we get from the Greeks to describe the two alternative ways of looking at nature, looking at the world. Is the world fundamentally irrational, disorderly, unpredictable? Is it chaotic? Or is it a cosmos? Is there some kind of regularity or order or lawfulness to nature? I was engaged in a debate, a public debate a number of years ago with a psychologist with all kinds of fancy degrees behind him, teaching at a prominent institution, and he denied this. He said there is no order to nature, and if you try to say there is, that's just you imposing order on nature. That you want there to be order, but there is no order out there in nature. So I asked this gentleman if he would cooperate with me and let us look at the bottom of his shoe. And he did cooperate. He put his shoe up on the thing. We analyzed the bottom of his shoe. I said, I noticed that you don't have any Velcro on the bottom of your shoe, to tie you down, hold you down to the carpet. Now, if you really believe the world is chaotic, gravity might just disappear and you might go zinging off into space. Why don't you anchor yourself down? Well, the truth of the matter is, he didn't really believe nature is chaotic. He assumed that he knew that gravity existed yesterday, it exists today, and he's pretty confident gravity is going to be around tomorrow. He didn't actually believe what he was saying. So, the laws of nature implies a natural whole, and a natural whole that is orderly, that is lawful, that is therefore intelligible. We can investigate nature and know certain things about it because certain things reoccur over and over and over. We can make sense of nature. We witness this every day. Every day when we observe the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. Have you ever noticed this strange thing? Have you ever noticed that human beings always give birth to babies, and dogs always give birth to puppies, and there's never a mix-up. Never. There's a kind of order there, inherent in the nature of things. Well, where did that order come from? Where did that lawful relationship come from? Did you make that happen? Did you make it so that dogs give birth to puppies and human beings give birth to babies? No, you didn't do that. I didn't do that. Well, who did do that? The Declaration gives us an answer. Nature's God. Thus, it's appealing to the laws of nature and that divine lawgiver, nature's God. Okay, who's that? Who exactly is nature's God? Here we see evidence of the supreme political prudence of the American founders. Their appeal to the divine is in the most non-sectarian way imaginable. Here's all that the Declaration so far has asked you to agree with. It has asked you to agree that there's a world larger than you, there's a nature, that nature has certain laws, that it's orderly, intelligible, and that those laws come from some source above you. We're going to call it nature's God. The idea is it didn't come from you. You're not the source of truth in the universe. You're not the source of order in the universe. It's something higher than you, but it intentionally leaves the identity of that supreme being vague, ambiguous. This will become the ground of religious liberty. So far, those three conditions, that there's a world bigger than us, there's an orderliness to it, and that we did not create it, but some being above us, some nature's God is responsible for that. I think these are three perfectly rational conclusions of the natural world in which we find ourselves. Certainly, any believer would agree with that, wouldn't they? Would that offend the conscience? Those three premises. There's a world bigger than you, it's orderly and intelligible, and you didn't create it. Would that offend any Protestant's faith? Would that offend the faith of any Catholic? Would it offend the piety of any Jew? For that matter, would it offend the belief of any Muslim? No. This becomes the ground of religious liberty. This is what the Declaration asks you to accept in order to understand the political argument of constitutional government and free society that will follow. In fact, not only does it not violate any of those religious beliefs, I would argue it doesn't violate the belief of any atheist. A reasonable, honest atheist. If you asked an atheist, is there a world larger than yourself? Are you part of a larger world? Sure. All he has to do is look around. Yeah, there's a world bigger than me. Is that world intelligible? Yes, it's intelligible. That's why the psychologist didn't anchor himself down to the carpet. He thinks it's intelligible. And did we create that intelligibility? No, it comes from someplace else. It does not come from us. Thus, one could be an atheist, and if one had a clear reasoning mind, one could have access to the beginning premise of the Declaration of Independence. And this is important. Think of the audience here of the Declaration. It tells us the audience at the end. Whose opinions are the Americans addressing? A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So in other words, they are not drawing on 18th century prejudices and addressing fellow 18th century Englishmen. They are appealing to laws of nature, and they're addressing all mankind. You recall, right, what happened, that terrible episode in the late 1980s in Tiananmen Square? This group of college students out there. You remember the response by the Chinese government? Protesting students were met with tanks. The tanks came in, and they had these nice little convenient windows that were steel flap doors. And they could open those steel flap doors. It was convenient because then they could poke the barrel of their machine guns out. And they could mow down all of the college students out there, which is exactly what they did. Does anyone know what those college students were reading out loud? The Declaration of Independence. They were appealing to the laws of nature and nature's God. If we could go back in time and someone could tell Thomas Jefferson, the main author of this document, you know, there's some Chinese kids reading this and making these arguments 200 years later, I think Jefferson would say, of course. Sure, anyone can understand this. This is not confined to a certain time period. These arguments are not only for a certain type of people or a certain culture or a certain race. We're appealing to the laws of nature. Any rational mind, doesn't matter what someone looks like, doesn't matter what language they speak, doesn't matter what color their skin is, has access to these principles if only they stop and think about it. In that sense, I argue, the American Revolution is truly radical, is truly revolutionary, because it appeals to principles that can be understood and embraced by all mankind, not merely by one part. It's not partial in that sense. Well, let's move on to the real meat of the argument of the Declaration of Independence. The next sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Let's stop there for a moment. We'll get to the content of this truth in a minute. What is a self-evident truth? Somebody offer us a definition. What is a self-evident truth? Or are there self-evident truths? What do you think? Anybody want to venture a guess? Plain to see and universally understood. Another way would be to say that self-evident is obvious. This is what most scholars of the Declaration of Independence today, if they address this question at all, would argue, that self-evident means obvious. And here we start to peer into the intellectual mind of those who framed the Declaration of Independence. These were people steeped in the Western philosophic tradition. And self-evident is a philosophic term of art. It actually has a fairly precise philosophic meaning. It's made most clearly by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa, but if you want the full-blown explanation, you go all the way back to Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, that wonderful book. I know you all were reading that this morning before you came to the seminar. It turns out self-evident is not obvious. It's not the same as obvious. A self-evident truth is a true proposition whose evidence is contained in the terms of the proposition. Or to use the definition that Aquinas offers, a self-evident truth is a proposition whose predicate is contained in the subject. That once you understand what the subject is, you already understand the predicate. Let me give you an example of a self-evident truth. Aside from you mathematicians in the room, is everyone else having nightmares from high school geometry class? Right? You remember this? What is this? This is the Pythagorean theorem, right? What does the Pythagorean theorem say? It says that there's this peculiar relationship between and among the parts of a right triangle. That if you square the two legs and you add them together, it always equals the square of the hypotenuse. Yes? And presumably, we probably have high school teachers, high school geometry teachers all across the country, all across the world, every day, teaching that this is true, right? If little Johnny writes this, His math teacher would probably count it wrong, make him go back and do it again. But has anyone ever measured every conceivable right triangle? Is it possible to measure every conceivable right triangle? No. There's an infinite variety of right triangles. Right triangles can be infinitely large and infinitely small. No one has ever measured them. So if I was Johnny, and Johnny gets it wrong, I'd say, "Whoa, Miss Smith, have you ever measured every right triangle? If you have not, maybe there is a right triangle where that's true." So if we haven't actually measured every conceivable right triangle, why are we so convinced that this is true? How do we know it? Well, it is a self-evident truth. Once one understands the terms of the proposition, you understand the nature or the constitution of a right triangle. What constitutes a right triangle? What is A? What does A mean? What is B? What is C? How do these parts relate to each other? Once you understand the terms of the proposition, you understand the truthfulness of the proposition as best humanly possible. There is no better way to know the truthfulness of the Pythagorean theorem. In that sense, it's not obvious, right? None of us, every one of us who have suffered through high school geometry knows this is not obvious. You have to work at it and try to figure it out, but it is self-evident in the sense the evidence is contained in the terms of the proposition. Or to use Aquinas' definition, the predicate, c squared equals c squared, is already contained in the subject, a squared plus b squared. Once you understand what a and b are, what it means to square them and add them, you have already known what the square of the hypotenuse is. This fellow Pythagoras, any historians in the room who study the Greeks, maybe know something about Pythagoras? I don't know anything about Pythagoras myself, other than he must have had an awful lot of time on his hands. Yes? I mean, this guy, what's he doing? He's sketching out triangles, and he's measuring them, and squaring them, and adding them, and think about this. Travel back in time to the day before Pythagoras was born. You with me? When was Pythagoras? I don't even know, what, roughly 500 BC, something like that. The day before Pythagoras was born. There's no Pythagoras walking around the world measuring triangles. You with me? At that moment, how many people knew this? Nobody. Pythagoras hadn't discovered it yet. It was a truth that no one yet knew. When Pythagoras has his eureka moment, right? Aha! You square the things and you add them, and then it's always equal to the other thing squared. And at that moment, how many people in the world understand this? One. Today, every poor kid who gets tortured in high school geometry class, millions of people know the Pythagorean theorem. Here's my point. The truthfulness of a self-evident truth in no way depends on the number of people who believe it or affirm it. You with me? This was true when no one knew it. It remains true when one person knew it. It remains true when millions of people know it. Its truthfulness does not rest on a popularity contest. It doesn't matter how many people know it. It is a self-evident truth waiting to be discovered. We could tear up every geometry book. We could stop teaching these things. The human race could forget about the Pythagoras theorem. And at some time in the future, some person sitting there sketching out right triangles could rediscover this because it's a truth inherent in right triangles. Well, the founders were not concerned with mathematics. Actually, some were, but most of them weren't, not in the Declaration of Independence. Here's our self-evident truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Here's the grand question. Is that true? What do you think? Is that a self-evident truth? Notice the question I'm asking. I am not asking a historical question. If someone said, well, what did the founders mean by this? That's the question a historian would raise. What did the founders mean? What did Jefferson mean? What did the other Americans at that time mean? That's a historical question. What was their view? Suppose, for the sake of argument, I do not think this is true, but for the sake of argument, I will concede, I'll put on the table. Let's suggest that all the founders were stupid, hypocritic, racist bigots and did not mean what they say. Let's assume that. That still leaves the question, is this true? The question, is this true, is not a historical question, it's a philosophic question. Is it true that all men are created equal? This question is, in a way, the most important political question, the most important moral question we can raise about the United States of America. The entire American Revolution, the entire American experiment in self-government rests upon this principle. The whole, what the founders would call the social compact theory of government, spins out of this principle. If this principle is false, then the American Revolution is a sham. It's a fraud. It's based on a lie. So it seems to us, as it seems to me, as Americans, we want to know, is this actually true? A wonderful experiment in class is to have students look at each other, turn and look at each other for a minute, and have them start talking about the many ways that we are unequal. You notice any inequalities? Of course, and they come up with all kinds of lists, right? There's infinite variety of physical, intellectual, moral characteristics in which we are unequal. We differ. Look right here in this room. Right? Some of you are tall, some of you are short, some of you are pretty, some of you are not. Some of you are thin, some of you are not. Some of you are really smart. Oh, come on. Everyone in this room is smart, all right? Okay, there we go. The point is, you can make a long list of the ways human beings are unequal from each other, or differ from each other. Is there some way, some important way, that we're all equal? And the founder said, yes, there is. We are equal in our human nature. Not one of us in this room can lay claim to being more human than anyone else. Right? I am assuming we have no gods present. Is that fair to say? Any gods or angels in the room? None. Any irrational beasts incapable of understanding articulate speech? Logos? No? Unless you're dozing, right? Unless you're sleeping right now. Isn't it the case that everyone in this room is a being in between gods and beasts? We're lower than God. We're higher than beasts. All of us are human beings. All of us possess this peculiar combination of reason and passion, speech, logos, and appetite. Every one of us has that kind of soul. In that sense, it is true that all men are created equal as men, as human beings, as members of the human race, as members of mankind. Now, some people think, well, big deal. That's so simple. Okay, so all human beings are equally human. Big deal. Well, it turns out to be a very big deal. It turns out to be the most radical, revolutionary moral and political principle discovered in political history. It threatens every form of illegitimate political hierarchy. If you are a European king operating, justifying your rule according to the divine right of kings theory, the last thing you want is your subjects to be thinking about this. You're worried if people start thinking about this self-evident truth. There's a whole political argument that flows from this principle. Let's read on a little more. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are qualifications. They help us understand how human beings are equal. We are equal in that all of us have been endowed by a Creator with certain unalienable rights. These rights that we have, what are these rights? First of all, there's something that we are endowed with by a Creator. This is a massively important political distinction that will be challenged 100 years after the founding. The Declaration argues that your most important rights are natural rights. They're in your nature, the way you're created. They come from God, not from government. You notice so far in the Declaration, there has been no mention of government. We have rights, the most important rights, the key rights, these inalienable rights, before there's any mention of government at all. So one thing we know, government's not in the business to give out rights. That's not the way it works. Rights, from the point of view of the Declaration, come from a Creator. They're unalienable because your nature cannot be alienated from you. No one can take your humanity from you. They can kill you and turn you into a corpse, but of course then you're no longer a human being. So long as you're a live human being, you have a nature, the nature of a free, rational mind. Even if someone tries to confine your body, puts you behind bars, ties you up, you still have a free mind. You can still oppose it, right? You can still make an argument why that's unjust. Even if someone tapes your mouth shut, you can think in your mind. You can formulate in your mind an argument why that is unjust. Your free rational will cannot be alienated or taken away from you. That's why your natural rights cannot be alienated or taken away from you. They're in you. It's intrinsic to what you are as a human being. Well, what are these rights? The Declaration gives you the big three, the top cheese here. Among these are life. Why do you have the right to life? Because that is your nature. You have the nature of a living organism. You're not created as a rock. You're created as a living, metabolizing being. Thus, it is right for you to be alive. That is your telos. That is your end. That's your purpose. You're meant to be a living creature. What do you do with your life? How do you live your life? Well, unlike a slug, which operates entirely according to its instinct, you have a rational mind, which is the ground of freedom, of liberty. Thus, it is right for you not only to be alive, but to be alive and free. That's why you have an unalienable right to liberty. It's what you're made to be. You're made to be a free creature. You're made to have the capacity to think, to choose about how to live your life freely. And what do you do when you're living freely, you're making decisions, you're making choices, big choices, small choices? What is the goal of all these choices? Aristotle opens his two most important books, the Nicomachean Ethics and his Politics, exactly the same way. Almost the exact same statement at the very opening page of Aristotle's Ethics and Politics. And that is that every human action points at one supreme goal: happiness. It's why we do everything that we want to do. It's the only human good that is in no way subordinate to other goods. Right? Every other good that you choose, you get up and you go to work on time. Why? Does that serve some end higher than itself? Sure. So you can get a paycheck, right? You can't get a paycheck if you don't show up for work. Well, is that the highest good, the paycheck? No. The paycheck's going to be used for things more important than the paycheck. You're going to use the money to buy a house, to buy some food. Well, why do you need the house? Well, that serves the higher good of having some shelter over your head. Every good, every human good points to something higher than itself. And Aristotle asked this question, is there one good that is not subordinate to any other good? It's never useful for something else. And he says there's one. Happiness. It's the end goal of all human action. We don't choose happiness for some other reason. Rather, we do lots of other things in order to be happy. So what do we do with our free lives? We pursue happiness. That's what you're meant to do as a human being. Thus, you have an inalienable, God-given, natural right to the pursuit of happiness. But notice the argument of the Declaration here. It does not say you have a right to happiness. It says you have a right to the pursuit of happiness. And here the Declaration offers a sort of hard teaching. It says, because you're a human being, because you're a free living creature, you should be protected in your right to pursue happiness. You have the right to freely pursue a happy life, to go out and work and try to carve out a decent, happy existence. There's no guarantee you'll ever achieve it. You don't have a right to happiness. You do have the right to work at it, meaning you should be protected in your person and your liberty and your property. No one should come along and injure you. No one should come along and steal from you. But there's no guarantee that you'll ever achieve happiness. That's going to be up to you. What is happiness? Suppose you buy all of this. I like to conduct this experiment with my thought experiment with my students. At this point, when I'm teaching the Declaration, I say, I've just discovered the fascinating world of heroin use. It's great. You shoot up massive loads of heroin and you feel euphoric. It's wonderful. I feel really happy about it. So I've been doing this a lot lately, and some of my friends have become alarmed, and they say, hey, Krannawitter, maybe you should cut back on the heroin use. It's not going to be very good for your career. You're not going to have a job. You're probably going to lose your family. You're going to lose your friends, and ultimately you'll probably lose your life. You're going to die because of this. And I respond and say, well, thank you for your concern. I have weighed these options, family, friends, career, health, versus being high on heroin. And in my view, the high on heroin is more pleasurable. It's more important to me. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you have different values. That's fine. My values elevate the use of heroin. So, according to the Declaration of Independence, I have an unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. Do I have the right to sit in my house and ingest massive doses of heroin? What do you think? Well, number one, that is the way that we understand rights today. I have rights. That means I have the right to do anything I find pleasurable. The right to do anything that I want to do. Who are you to tell me what happiness is or what my rights are? But consider the context of the Declaration of Independence. It says that these rights are endowments, right? We are endowed by our Creator with rights. What is an endowment? I suspect President Armstrong would welcome large donations to the endowment of Colorado Christian University. Am I correct about this, President?
We're certainly open to that.
Very, very good. So suppose, just for the sake of argument, Suppose you get a large gift to the endowment, the kind of checks we really like, the ones with lots of zeros at the end. And I'm in political science, so we in the social sciences, we're a partying type. So we take that money, or you take that money, and you hold the most massive orgy this campus has ever seen right out here in the quad. All the thrills. Every decadent thing one can think of. Drugs, booze, sex, you name it. Blowout. What do you think the donor would think about that? Would there be a problem? Oh, probably. Probably the last check you'd ever get from that man or woman. Well, where's the rub? Hey, he gave us a check. It was a gift to us. We used it. It became ours. We wanted to have a party with it, so we threw a party. Well, an endowment, what is an endowment? An endowment is a gift, but it's a gift with a purpose. An endowment to the university is a gift to be used for the purposes of the university. So an endowment to the university would mean that money should be used to build classrooms and hire faculty and offer scholarships and so on and so forth. In other words, an endowment implies some limitation on how the gift can rightly be used. Thus, if our rights are endowments, the declaration implies that there's some limitation on how those rights can be used. It does not make sense. It is not coherent within the context of the declaration to argue that I have a right to anything I want to do. No, you don't have a right to anything you want to do. You have a right to pursue happiness. Well, what does that mean? Take a look on the bottom of page 3. I'll give you what I think is the best gloss, the best explanation of happiness. A quotation from one of the most beautiful speeches in American history, George Washington's first inaugural. This is a remarkable speech. It's worth, I do a whole seminar on Washington's inaugural address. The address, think of it this way. It's the first time an American president is addressing the American people as Washington is sworn into office. And the whole speech takes the form of a prayer. The whole speech is thanking God for success in the Revolution and the founding under the Constitution. I'm happy that the ACLU wasn't around when Washington gave his speech. Here's what he said, President Washington: that the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. Wow. You ever had a student who says government shouldn't be legislating morality? And I say, son, go take up your beef with George Washington. Because he argued that the very foundation of public policy will be the pure and immutable principles of private morality. What is good for individual human beings, what's right for them, will be the standard of right for public policy. And you see in Washington there the assumption, contra the progressive view that I began this discussion with, the assumption that human nature doesn't change. The principles of private human morality are immutable because human nature is immutable. It doesn't change. He says in the next sentence, I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature. So in our nature, there is an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. Is that not beautiful? George Washington, in this one sentence, I believe, has he not just captured the essence of all ancient Greek moral philosophy as well as biblical morality? That that happiness and virtue are bound up together. The pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of virtue, the pursuit of excellence. That's what virtue means. The pursuit of moral and intellectual excellence, being the very best that you can be as a human being. That's what the pursuit of happiness means. Let's read the rest of this. It's so wonderful. He says that there's an indissoluble union between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered, perhaps as deeply, as finely staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. It is this beautiful statement of American exceptionalism. If we cannot make self-government work here, think of all the conditions we have here. We have a people who are accustomed to governing themselves. We have a people who understand these principles. We have our George Washington. We have our Thomas Jefferson to pen the Declaration of Independence. We have a James Madison and an Alexander Hamilton to figure out how to design a constitution. We have all these key people in place to make all of this work. If we can't make it work here, where else is it going to work? Let's turn back to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration goes on and introduces the idea of government. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What exactly is the purpose of government? To secure these rights. What rights? Those inalienable rights with which we are endowed by our Creator. Thus, the purpose of government is limited to protecting our God-given natural rights. In a way, every serious political fight today is a fight over the meaning, over the definition of rights, or the source or the origin of rights. The argument we find in the Declaration of Independence and the American founding in general is the view that our most important rights are God-given natural rights, and therefore government has the limited purpose of protecting that which we already have, a natural kind of liberty, natural kind of rights. Thus, a government of limited purpose should be a government of limited power. And how might one limit the power of government? Well, a very useful mechanism is a written constitution. You write down for all citizens to see and for those in government to see. Here are the powers granted to government, and here's a list of restrictions, things government may not do. You limit the power of government. Because the idea of the Declaration is a government of unlimited power is a government more likely to threaten rights rather than secure them. The modern view is very different. The argument that the progressives develop is an argument that rights are not natural. They reject wholesale. They reject the idea of natural rights, the idea of God-given rights. They say rights are historical rights. Different cultures, different peoples develop rights over time. Rights are organic gifts from the state. Government, in other words, is the source of rights from the progressive point of view. Well, the whole constitutional argument that flows from that premise is very different. If government is the source of rights, things like the right to a house, the right to a job, the right to an education, you see the difference between a government-granted right and a natural right. Your natural rights, the right to exercise your natural liberty, the right to speak freely, the right to worship freely, the right to assemble with your friends freely. What do you need from me to exercise your natural rights, your natural liberty? Nothing. You don't need anything from me other than for me to leave you alone. You don't need anything from me to exercise your natural rights. But suppose you have a right to a house. What do you need from me? Well, if you cannot afford a house, you might need my money or my property. Right? The idea of government-granted rights requires some level of redistribution of property among citizens. Thus, from the modern progressive point of view, if rights originate in government, then the bigger government becomes, the more rights it can dole out. So from the progressive point of view, we want larger government because it can dish out more entitlements. That's why Woodrow Wilson called the Constitution witchcraft, because the Constitution stands in the way of building that kind of modern entitlement state. The Declaration says, after announcing this purpose, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Several things here. Governments are instituted among men, meaning it is a clear rejection of the divine right theory of kings. Here in America, we don't believe that God anoints some man or some group of people to lord over others. We believe government is a human invention. Human beings come together, and by exercising their reason, by recognizing their equal rights of each other, they form a government. And this government requires two things to be legitimate. There are lots of illegitimate governments based on either force or fraud. But to be a legitimate exercise of political power, government requires the consent of the governed. Why? Why does government need the consent of the governed? The answer is because all men are created equal. Because all men are created equal, because all human beings possess the same natural rights, you have no right to rule over me without my permission. If you want to make rules and regulations that are binding on me, you need to get my consent to do it legitimately. And the same thing if I want to rule you and make rules and regulations and laws that will be binding on you. But consent, while consent is necessary, consent is not sufficient. Suppose a nation of people gave their consent to unjust policies. Suppose a nation of people gave their consent to enslave some neighboring country, or to enslave some minority within them. The Declaration says that legitimate government derives its just power from the consent of the governed, not unjust power. In a way, this is the whole challenge of self-government, is to combine consent with justice. Now, how does one do this? In theory, this is very easy. You get the people to consent to a fair, just government that offers, at a minimum, offers equal protection for equal rights. In theory. In practice, it turns out to be one of the thorniest problems ever. What do you do when a people will not consent to justice? And the Americans wrestle with precisely this problem in the case of African chattel slavery. What do you do with a nation of people who are accustomed to consenting to their government, but they have deeply vested interests in the institution of slavery, and they will not consent to abolish it overnight? It would injure them. It would injure themselves. They're not going to consent to bring that kind of injury on themselves. Well, if these are the two conditions for legitimacy, consent and justice, and you cannot achieve both, the social compact theory says there are two options. Either you preserve the consent that you have, and you temporarily give up on justice. You say, we're going to work with this consent and try to improve opinion and improve public policy and try to build up justice, work toward justice. The other option, one could argue, well, this nation of people is too unenlightened, too barbaric to give their consent, so we will not ask for their consent. We will impose justice on them without their permission. Either way, you're falling short of the conditions of freedom. Either way, you're falling short of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But that's the great challenge in the American founding. How do you, in practice, try to achieve this? I'm going to say a little bit more about slavery in a few minutes. Let's read here just a little bit more from the Declaration. The Declaration argues that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, so those rights, securing rights, now becomes the end, the goal of political society. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's the goal, the safety and happiness of political society. It is the alpha and omega, the beginning and end of Aristotle's politics. He says that's the purpose of the regime, is to secure the safety and happiness of the people. When government, this is very useful in grabbing the attention of students. It says that the people have the right to alter or abolish their government when it's failing to do this. Right? So if your government is not doing such a hot job of protecting the rights of those who live under it, you can tweak it, alter it, change it. If that doesn't work, we have the natural right, the God-given right to abolish it. What does the Declaration mean by that? They're talking about the right of revolution. And I think it's always useful to remind Americans, America was born out of revolution. Human beings who were brave enough to stand up and exercise their natural right to throw off a government they believed it was impossible, that there was no peaceful political recourse to address the injuries they had received. The Declaration goes on and makes a very interesting, builds on this argument. It says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Right? So you don't invoke the right of revolution for silly or petty injuries. But, it says, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, then it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. When you find yourself under a government where its whole design, what it is made to do is put you down, and there is no recourse, there is no avenue left to change this. At that moment, revolution is not merely a right, it is now a duty. It is an obligation. In that sense, it's very clear the American founders and the social contract theory they're operating from does not countenance pacifism. Their argument is you may not be a pacifist and be an American. You may be a pacifist and you may leave America. That's the first test of a free society. The door out always swings open. You're always free to leave if you don't want to, if you don't agree with these principles. But if you're going to be here and we're living under tyranny, and the whole purpose of us forming this government is for our safety and happiness, that means everyone has an obligation to fight in the revolution if needed. Revolution then becomes a duty. Let me. How should I do this? I want to sketch out for you a sort of thumbnail sketch of the conditions of freedom. I'm going to drag this over here so I can talk into the microphone. Here's a kind of survey, an outline of the political theory I think that's contained in the Declaration of Independence, and that I argue represents the best regime possible. It begins with this idea of human equality. How is it that human beings are said to be created equal? We're equal in our individual natural rights. I mentioned before, I always like to find the political edge wherever I can because it cuts a little bit And that tends to be provocative, and then people start paying attention. I was in a debate. I do a lot of speaking, and I like to debate in front of audiences so that the audience can see what's at stake here. And I was debating this, I would call her a feminist, and I think she would be comfortable with identifying herself as a feminist. And she said, "Professor Krannawitter, you don't even believe in women's rights." And I said, "Of course not. No, I don't believe in women's rights. I don't believe a woman has any right that I don't have. I don't believe in black rights. I don't believe in the rights of farmers. I don't believe in the rights of retired persons. I believe in individual natural rights. I think every human being has the same equal rights because we are equally human." And that's what the Declaration means. We're equal in our individual natural rights. So if we have these rights, what then is the purpose of government? The purpose of government is to secure these rights. If government has the limited purpose to secure our natural rights, what kind of government is most likely to do that? A government of limited powers or a government of unlimited powers? Some of you remember George Orwell's 1984, right? How would you describe that government? Is that a libertarian paradise in there? It's total government. It's complete government. It's government that knows no limitation on its power or scope. What we Americans argue is that type of government is more likely to harm our rights than protect our rights. Thus, we wisely choose limited government. And how might one limit the power of government? A written constitution is a very useful way to remind citizens of the limitations on the power of their government. So we opt for constitutional government. If we're going to have a written constitution, does it make any sense at all to exempt some parts of the government from the Constitution? To say, yeah, this Constitution is binding on everyone except the judicial branch or except Congress, right? That doesn't make any sense. Does it make any sense to exempt one class of citizens? No. So what do we insist? What we insist in America is that the Constitution reigns supreme over all citizens and all parts of the government. In other words, what we want is the rule of law. When you ask the question, who really rules or what really rules in America, the founders argue what ultimately rules is the law. No man, no human being, no group is above the authority of the Constitution. Now, this is sort of a thumbnail sketch of the political or governmental conditions of freedom. You have to have this if you're going to have a free and decent society. But this is inadequate. It's inadequate for this reason right here. Once you decide to limit the power of government, and reasonable people can disagree where exactly those limits should be, how much power should government have. But once you decide we are going to limit the power of government, you necessarily create a distinction between the private and the public realm. You are saying that there is going to be a realm of privacy. That's inherent in the idea of limited government. That there's some area of your private life that government will not intrude and boss you around. Traditionally, under the Constitution, this included things like business, economics. The whole economy was understood to be within the private realm. These are private citizens engaging in commerce and trade and contracts. You can run your business any way you want to. If you want to run your business in a really stupid way, that's up to you. You'll pay the penalties for it. If you want to be serious and industrious, that is entirely up to you. Family life was understood mainly within the private realm. Government's not going to come and tell you how to raise your kids, what books you have to read to them, how you're going to discipline them. Religion was understood within the private realm. In fact, this is the very ground of religious liberty. The idea that religion and religious conscience takes place within the private realm. Government's not going to come and tell you what to think about God or how to worship or what church you must belong to. In America, your civil rights in no way depend upon your religious professions. There is a very remarkable speech. In fact, I think I have a copy of it. Yeah, look on page 10, the very last page. This is a letter that Washington writes during his first administration to a group of Jews in Newport, Rhode Island. And here's what he says to them. The citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. He's talking to the rest of the world. If you want to solve your problems in the rest of the world, follow our principle of religious liberty. Think of what's going on in the Middle East today. They would do very well to adopt the principle of religious liberty. Washington says all, meaning everyone here in America, possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. You Jews are left to worship freely not because one class offers toleration, indulges you, and allows you, rather because all of America is dedicated to protecting the inherent natural right of each human being. That is your natural right. That's not just permission you're granted from others. That is your natural right to exercise. He says, for happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction. Right? If you want to be a bigot here in America, it's possible, but you're not going to find assistance in the principles of the founding. You cannot draw upon these principles to assist your bigotry. America doesn't give bigotry any sanction. If anything, America makes bigotry more difficult because the principles of the founding stand opposed to any kind of bigotry, racial bigotry, religious bigotry, any type of bigotry whatsoever. It gives to persecution no assistance, and it requires only, here is a key definition of citizenship from the first president. America requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. By placing religion outside the scope of government, by placing it within the private realm, the Americans solve the religious problems that had been plaguing Europe. For 300 years, Protestants and Catholics had been slaughtering each other by the millions over sectarian differences because in Europe, one's political rights depended on one's religious opinions. In the United States, by separating church and state, we say your civil rights in no way depend on your religious beliefs. You can be a Jew and be a full-blown American citizen who deserves complete equal protection under the law. It's the first time, I believe, in human history that a chief executive of a sovereign nation has welcomed a group of Jews as equal fellow citizens. This distinction between the private and the public, by saying there's a large realm of private affairs that government's not going to interfere with, government's not going to boss you around, I believe this is mainly responsible for unleashing a wave of creativity, industriousness, entrepreneurship that human history has never witnessed before, ever. Think about the story of America. Think of what the United States was at the time of the founding. It was a group of dirt poor farmers. We were nothing, surrounded by a world of massive imperial monarchies. And within several generations, America goes to become the most powerful, prosperous nation on earth. How does that happen? By the 1 century after the founding, by the end of the 19th century, the American economy is producing so much wealth that we have the greatest acts of philanthropy human history has ever seen. We have these people who figure out how to make all kinds of really useful things, steel and cars and other things. And what do they do with all that money? They build universities, they build hospitals, they build libraries. We have these tremendous acts of philanthropy, all that's made possible by the creation of this private realm. So there's a great opportunity here. There is also a great danger. I mentioned before that regime of Orwell's 1984. Big Brother, remember in the book, there are monitors watching you in every room. There is no private realm in Orwell's 1984. Well, one virtue that system has, there would probably be very little crime in such a system, right? I mean, when people are being watched 24 hours a day, they tend to be on their best behavior. So what will happen if you create a private realm? You're not going to watch people 24 hours a day. We're not going to have policemen on everyone's doorsteps. We're not going to have monitors watching people. How do you ensure that citizens will not abuse this privacy and injure their fellow citizens? And the founders gave an answer. Citizenship. Their argument was, this type of regime is possible for a particular kind of people. Our citizens must possess a particular type of character. Otherwise, this won't work. And what I've done is I've boiled down the conditions of citizenship into 4 qualities. First is self-restraint. To be an American citizen, you must be capable of restraining yourself. Self-government in the very first instance means the governance of oneself. One's mind, one's reason, controlling one's appetites. This is the definition of self-government that Aristotle offers in the 2nd book of his Ethics. If you cannot master yourself, if you cannot discipline your own appetites and passions, then you're not suited to be a citizen of a free society under a limited government. But just because we're controlling ourselves doesn't mean in any way that we are weak or inward-looking, just the opposite. The founders argue that Americans need to be self-assertive. I like to remind students of it. You remember that flag they used to fly during the founding period? Had that coiled up snake on it. Remember what it said underneath? Don't tread on me. Who were they talking to? They were talking to government. Don't get near me. You come step on me. I'm a vicious, poisonous snake. I'll attack you. I'll bite you. And when they said that, this was the Americans saying this. Who were these Americans? Why, these were the same people that just sent the British Army and Navy scampering back across the Atlantic Ocean. You tend to take those people seriously when they say, don't tread on me. Right? It's just the phrase that here, in fact, I think I quoted from this. Look on page 4. This last quotation from James Madison in the Federalist Papers, he's answering an objection. Some of the critics of the Constitution had raised this question, Couldn't Congress, when it's passing its laws, couldn't Congress pass laws that give an advantage to the members of Congress at the expense of everyone else? Couldn't Congress pass a law like that? Take away everyone else's money, and the law would say, and it would go to members of Congress, or something like that? Or pass laws that would give some advantage to a favored class of citizens? And here's Madison's response. Madison says, if it be asked, what is to restrain government from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves in a particular class of society, I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws. In order to get that kind of law through, you'd have to get an entire majority of the House, an entire majority of the Senate. You'd have to have the executive branch in cahoots. You'd have to have so many people agreeing it's unlikely to happen. But more important, he says, above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. Right? These Americans, as long as you are assertive, manly, vigilant, and this goes for both men and women, we have to be spirited, vigilant, manly in calling government on the carpet when they do things they're not supposed to do. And he goes on, he says, if this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. If Americans become so debased and unspirited and weak that they allow their government to pass laws that discriminate in favor of government and the people don't do anything about it, then those people are not fit for freedom. That's the people who, they simply don't have the character necessary to maintain a limited constitutional government. Here's the sad news. Our government's been passing such laws for 40 years. Routinely. All the time, they make exceptions. In the 1980s, the Washington Post had a whole series of articles. They went over, for example, and they found in the basement of Congress all these workrooms, people working down there in conditions that violated federal workplace regulations, because in those laws, those workplace regulations, Congress exempted itself. The laws didn't apply to Congress, but if you own a business, you own a factory, you have to comply with the law. So we need citizens who are capable of governing themselves, restraining themselves. We need citizens who are self-assertive. But how is one to know when to stand up and call government on the carpet? And the answer is civic knowledge. We need citizens. This is not to say that citizens have to be constitutional lawyers or experts in political philosophy, but all Americans should know something about this, something about the basis of their rights, something about the purpose and meaning of their Constitution and of their government. Yeah, all citizens should know something about this. And finally, in order to keep limited government limited, you need citizens capable of being self-reliant. You need citizens who will take responsibility for the well-being of themselves and their families. Once citizens start to turn to government to provide for them, you cannot maintain limited government. It will require lots of resources to provide for the American people. And if the Americans decide we want government to provide things for us, then you have to give up on limited government. You give up on all of this. And thus you want strong families, you want a strong work ethic, you want strong sense of individual responsibility. Now, all of this taken together, I would argue, represents the conditions of freedom and the best regime. I don't know how the human mind could discover or conjure a regime superior to this. And this is what the American founding holds out as a model. These are the social contract theories or principles of the American founding that I would argue we've been working for a long time to meet up to. I'm looking at the clock, and it's getting late, and I suppose I've probably provoked a number of you, and I want to make sure that there's time for questions. So can we open it up to questions? Is that okay, John? Okay. Please, jump right on in. Anyone with criticisms, questions, comments?
You said you would speak later or about slavery, and I was anxious to hear what you had.
Absolutely. As a student and scholar of Lincoln, this tends to be the subject reigns very large in my own scholarship. I argue that the problem of slavery in the American founding and the ensuing years is not a reason to be embarrassed or ashamed of America. Just the opposite. The best way to discover the goodness, the moral goodness, the genuine decency of America is through a rigorous study of slavery. Here's what I mean. Slavery is an incredibly old institution. It's been around since the beginning of recorded history, right? The Americans did not invent the institution of slavery. In 1776, slavery existed on every quarter of the globe. Thus, the existence of slavery in America in 1776 in no way made America unique. Just the opposite. The existence of slavery made slavery perfectly typical, or made America perfectly typical. It's what you would expect, right? Why shouldn't the Americans have slavery? Everyone else had slavery. It exists all over. In the 1830s and 40s, when both the British and French empires, respectively, are debating on whether or not to abolish slavery, tribal chiefs from the Congo and other West African nations send delegates to Paris and London who go there. These are dark, black-skinned Africans speaking before pasty white Europeans, begging the Europeans, please don't end slavery. This is great business for Africa. We're making a lot of money on this. We don't want you to stop it. Slavery exists all over the globe. So slavery does not make America unique, but one thing does. What does make America unique? Of all the nations of slave owners, only one stands up and declares the principle that all men are created equal. And before the ink is dried on the Declaration of Independence, slavery becomes a problem in America. And is it not the case that slavery is a problem only in a good regime? Slavery is not considered to be a problem in a bad regime. The Nazis never sat and fretted overnight about, oh, goodness, we have Jewish slavery here in Nazi Germany. It wasn't a problem for them. In America, slavery not only becomes a problem, it becomes the problem. It becomes such a problem that within 77 years, more than 600,000 Americans, actually let's put this in the right context, more than 600,000 mostly white Americans are slaughtering each other over the problem of black slavery. Where had that happened in human history? That is not something to be embarrassed of. That is something to be proud of. We Americans were so serious about the principle of equality, we shed enormous amounts of blood to get rid of it. We have a current Attorney General, Holder, who just gave a speech 2 weeks ago commemorating Black History Month. Did any of you catch this? And he said in his speech that America has always been and remains a nation of cowards when it comes to race. Cowards? Think of what the Americans did under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln from 1861 to 1865. Whatever you call, however you describe what happened at Gettysburg Battlefield or Antietam or Shiloh, it's not cowardice. The Americans confront the problem of race and slavery in a way that no nation before in human history ever had. The only challenges to slavery you find before America are obscure philosophers who disagree with it in books. But in America, slavery becomes a public and political problem, a problem that cannot be avoided, a problem that was necessary. America was destined to some kind of reckoning over the problem of slavery because it was founded on these good principles. And thus, I concede not 1 inch of moral high ground to any critic of America. When critics raise the question, they'll say, well, why didn't the Americans get rid of slavery? If they really believe this, why didn't they get rid of it immediately? First of all, the Americans actually did everything prudence would allow. From 1776 through 1800, this is 24 years. In 24 years, half of the American states abolished slavery. We passed the Northwest Ordinance, which stops the spread of slavery to the territory, and we prohibit the importation of African slaves through the Atlantic slave trade. We literally treat slavery like a cancer. We confine it to where it exists. The rub is, under the Constitution, slavery is entirely a matter of state policy. The national government has no authority. So the only way to get rid of slavery in, say, South Carolina is for the people of South Carolina to give their consent to get rid of it. And that takes time to move souls, to move opinions, to show people why justice is more important than their immediate economic interest.
And Tom, that's because of the consent-justice trade-off that occurred at the founding, right?
Absolutely.
They were putting off the justice problem.
They were putting off the justice because they thought, we have achieved a large degree of consent, unprecedented in human history. Let's preserve the consent we have and work within that realm to get those who are consenting to abolish slavery. So when people say, why didn't the founders instantly get rid of it? That's actually a stupid question. It's a stupid question. A much smarter question is to ask the question, why did the Americans do what they did? Why did they declare this principle that all men are created equal, which transformed slavery into a problem? Why did they do that? Were they obligated to do that? Was there some precedent? Had anyone else ever attempted to found a self-governing republic and a free and just civil society on the principle that all men are created equal? There is no model of that in Africa. There's no model of that in Europe. Nowhere in the peaks of Roman civilization or Greek civilization is there a model of that. That is the best sign of the genius of the American founding. So not for 1 second do I think that we should back away from a discussion of slavery. I say confront that discussion. And if we want to argue, well, the Americans failed in practice, they didn't do everything they should have done. Well, that's to say men are not angels. Wouldn't it be perfect? Wouldn't it be wonderful if every one of us acted in a way that was perfectly right and perfectly just all the time? If it was true, we wouldn't have politics and we wouldn't need government. This is the political problem of human beings. Others? Yes, sir.
Dr. Krannawitter, what is your reaction to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948?
Well, the UN's Declaration of Rights is in large measure a reflection of the kind of progressive rejection of the founding that I was mentioning. If you read through the UN's charter and their Declaration of Rights, it really sounds much more like something Franklin Roosevelt might propose in the New Deal. A right to housing, a right to health insurance, a right to education. It is an abandonment of the natural rights principles of the American founding. So in that sense, I don't think it is a universal It claims to be a universal declaration of rights, but they're not universal rights. The only way that you can have a right to a house is if there's a certain economic condition. You have to have some money and resources to build a house. So it's really it's not universal rights in the sense that natural rights, natural liberty is universal. So I don't think that from its inception, I don't think the UN is modeling itself on this. I think the UN quite consciously is rejecting this. Yes, sir.
Dr. Krannawitter, I was wondering how, in your opinion, Ron Paul fits in with your agenda, which you sketched out.
Well, I mean, Ron Paul's interesting. I think Ron Paul leans too much in the libertarian direction, where on certain issues he seems to be, he almost seems to be anti-government. And the fact is, the American founders were not libertarians. The founders were not anti-government. The founders argued for good government. What they wanted was, to use the phrase of the Federalist Papers, they want energetic, good government. A government that is small in its scope, but has the energy to do the few things it's supposed to do well. So, for example, in the area of national security and national defense, you want energy in the government. You want the government to actually perform its job well. So I don't agree with Ron Paul on everything, but certainly Ron Paul is one of the few people out there who he's trying to understand and get back to this kind of framework of constitutional government. Politically, just as a matter of practical strategy, I don't think he has a good read on American politics today. When I opened up and I said that I think our Constitution has become largely irrelevant, one sign that I'm right is the response to Ron Paul. What happens when Ron Paul pulls out his Constitution? People snicker and laugh and dismiss him. And that's powerful evidence that no one cares to hear what the Constitution says or whether some program is constitutional or not. So before we can actually start pointing to provisions of the Constitution the way Ron Paul does, first we need to persuade Americans that they should care about their Constitution, that limited constitutional government is in their interest, is better for them, rather than unlimited bureaucratic government. That's hard work to not do, and we have to do that first before we can have a serious discussion about the Constitution. Yeah, please.
So as I look around the world today, I keep hearing a lot about what you're talking about. And as I look around the world today, what I'm seeing is the government is becoming very unlimited. So if this continues to happen, what, in your opinion, does that mean for America down the road? And also, what does that mean for me? What can I do, and what can we do as Americans to help stop this?
That's a perfect last question.
It is a perfect last question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address the pessimistic part of your question first and then the optimistic part at the end. I agree with you. We have moved largely away from the conditions of constitutional government. We no longer care or know what it means. I tend to have a rather gloomy view of the near future. I think we will continue in the same direction until we feel some kind of squeeze, some kind of pain that really forces Americans to think in a different way. When you ask the question, what can you do about it? You can teach this. We're here, right? We're here as part of a university, and what do? We teach. This is what we do. So we engage young Americans. When I walk into my classroom, the very first day, I introduce myself, and I acknowledge we're here in a college setting, so you have to take tests and quizzes, and I have to grade them and all that sort of stuff that none of us like to do. But I also remind them that's not the main reason I'm here. I am here to talk to you as fellow citizens. We are all citizens of this country, and therefore I have a vested interest in what you people think about your country. Even if you have no political opinions at all, even if you never vote, well, that just means you're going to allow a bunch of jerks to take control of things. I care about that. And you people have a vested interest in my opinions about this country because we're all going to live under the laws and policies that we make. Therefore, I address my students, as I tell them, I will address you as fellow citizens deliberating on the fate of freedom in the United States of America. And we're going to talk about these principles. We're going to talk about policies. We're going to make arguments. I'm going to make arguments. And if I'm wrong, you show me where I'm wrong. You have that responsibility to correct my way. I'm going to correct your way when I think you're wrong. And this is what citizens of a free country do. We debate and deliberate on what all of this means and try to recover the moral and political conditions of freedom. The end.